Imagine standing on the edge of an untamed continent in the year 1590. Behind you lies 3,000 miles of cold, gray Atlantic Ocean. Before you stands an impenetrable wall of dark, ancient American forest. You are an English captain returning to the island outpost where you left your daughter, your son-in-law, and your newborn granddaughter, the very first English child born in the New World. But when you step onto the shore, there is no welcoming committee. There are no sounds of cattle, no smoke rising from chimneys, and no signs of a struggle. The sturdy wooden homes have been systematically dismantled. The heavy iron cannons are gone, and carved into a massive oak tree at the entrance of the abandoned fort is a single cryptic word left behind as a silent witness: CROATOAN. For anyone fascinated by the deep, rugged roots of early American settlement, the vanishing of the Roanoke colony is the country's oldest and most enduring ghost story. It is a factual historical puzzle that sits perfectly at the crossroads of early Elizabethan politics, brutal wilderness survival, and an inexplicable disappearance that has baffled archaeologists for nearly 500 years. Pour yourself a fresh cup, dim the lights, and let us sail back to the fog-shrouded coast of 16th century North Carolina, where an entire civilization simply dissolved into the woods. The enterprise of Virginia. Our narrative begins in the glittering cutthroat court of Queen Elizabeth I. The year is 1587. England is locked in a cold war with Spain, and the Queen's favorite explorer, Sir Walter Raleigh, conceives a brilliant, dangerous plan: establish a permanent English base in North America to act as a staging ground for privateers hunting Spanish treasure ships. But Raleigh didn't just send soldiers, he wanted a true colony. He gathered 115 middle-class English citizens, men, women, and children, who were willing to trade the cobblestone streets of London for a dream of free land in the New World. Among them was a talented artist and mapmaker named John White, appointed as the colony's governor. When their 3 wooden ships dropped anchor off the coast of Roanoke Island, a narrow strip of land protected by the treacherous sandbars of the Outer Banks, the settlers were captivated. John White painted watercolors of the lush maritime forests, the teeming wildlife, and the thriving villages of the local Algonquian peoples. To the settlers, it looked like paradise, but paradise quickly soured. They had arrived too late in the season to plant crops. Their food stores were dwindling, and relations with the local native tribes were highly volatile. Tensions boiled over when a misunderstanding led to the accidental killing of a friendly native chieftain, plunging the island into a state of quiet, terrifying siege. Yet, amidst the growing dread, a beacon of hope emerged. On August 18th, 1587, Governor John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Virginia because she was the very first English child born in the soil of the new continent. But a newborn baby cannot eat hope. By late August, the colonists realized that if they did not get emergency supplies from England before winter, every single one of them would starve in the wilderness. They begged Governor John White to sail back with the ships to secure food, tools, and reinforcements. White was torn. He didn't want to leave his family alone on the edge of an untamed world, but on August 27th, 1587, he boarded a ship and watched the outline of Roanoke Island fade into the Atlantic mist, promising to return by the following spring. He had no idea it would take him 3 agonizing years to get back. the Spanish Wall of Time. When John White arrived back in England, he found the country in a state of absolute military panic. The Spanish Armada, a massive fleet of 130 warships, was sailing up the English Channel to invade the nation. Queen Elizabeth issued a total embargo on all shipping. Every single vessel, from the grandest galleon to the smallest fishing boat, was seized by the Crown to defend the homeland. White pleaded with Raleigh, he pleaded with the Privy Council, he even petitioned the Queen herself. But the survival of England took priority over 115 souls lost in the American woods. For 3 years, John White was trapped in Europe, pacing the docks of Plymouth, staring across the ocean, knowing that with every passing winter, the odds of his daughter and granddaughter surviving were dropping to zero. Finally, in the spring of 1590, after the Armada had been defeated, White secured passage on a rough, unruly fleet of privateer ships heading to the West Indies. On August 15, 1590, almost 3 years to the day after he had left, White's ship finally approached the Outer Banks. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the crew spotted a thick column of white smoke rising from the north end of Roanoke Island. White's heart soared. Smoke meant fires. Fires meant people. His family was alive. The carving on the oak. The next morning, August 16th, John White and a contingent of armed sailors rowed their wooden longboats toward the shore. The sea was rough, and a sudden squall capsized one of the boats, drowning the captain and 6 experienced sailors. The men were shaken, superstitious, and reluctant to go any further, but White pushed them onward. They reached the shore and began walking through the thick maritime forest toward the settlement. As they walked through the trees, they began to sing English folk songs, shouting out into the brush to let the colonists know that friends had arrived. But their voices only echoed hollowly off the live oaks. No one answered. When they broke through the tree line into the clearing where the settlement stood, the sight stopped John White dead in his tracks. The colony was completely gone. The 70-odd wooden thatched roof houses hadn't been burned down by an enemy. There were no charred timbers, no broken arrows, and no signs of a panicked battle. Instead, the houses had been carefully, deliberately taken apart. The heavy timber beams had been unpinned and removed, as if the occupants had packed up their lives with absolute order and precision. White ran toward the defensive perimeter of the settlement. The area had been enclosed by a high military-style palisade of heavy tree trunks, a fort built after his departure. As White reached the entrance of the wooden fort, his eyes fell upon one of the main support posts. The bark had been stripped away and carved deep into the wood. In stark capital letters were 3 letters. CRO. White's breath caught. He remembered the strict agreement he had made with the colonists before he left 3 years earlier. If they were forced to leave the island due to distress or attack, they were to carve the name of their destination into a tree or a doorpost. And if they were in danger, they were to carve a heavy Maltese cross above the name. White frantically searched the post, the surrounding trees, and the logs of the fort. There was no cross. Not a single scratch of distress was found anywhere in the timber. He walked further into the abandoned fort. Carved into another massive ancient oak tree near the center of the clearing was the full word CROATOAN, the island of the blue-eyed natives. CROATOAN was the name of a neighboring barrier island located about 50 miles to the south, modern-day Hatteras Island. It was also the home of the CROATOAN tribe, a peaceful seafaring people led by Manteo, a brilliant native man who had traveled to London with Raleigh years prior and was a staunch ally of the English. To John White, the message was crystal clear. The colonists had run out of food, dismantled their village, and moved south to live under the protection of Manteo's people on Hatteras Island. White rushed back to the ships, demanding that the fleet weigh anchor and sail south immediately to CROATOAN. But the Atlantic was not done with John White. A massive Atlantic hurricane began to bear down on the Outer Banks. The wind roared, and the ships lost their heavy iron anchors, nearly crashing onto the shallow sandbars. Food and fresh water on the privateer ships were critically low, and the captains refused to risk their vessels in a storm for a group of missing settlers. Over White's desperate tears and protests, the ships turned east, blowing out into the open ocean, forcing a return to England via the Azores. John White never raised enough money to return to America again. He died a broken man on an estate in Ireland, never knowing the fate of his daughter Eleanor or little Virginia Dare. The gray shadows of Hatteras. For over a century, the fate of the lost colony remained a dark footnote in history. But as the 17th century progressed and new waves of English settlers began to push deeper into the interior of North Carolina, they began to encounter things in the woods that defied explanation. In 1701, a famed English explorer and surveyor named John Lawson journeyed to Hatteras Island, the old CROATOAN. He embedded himself with the Hatteras tribe and wrote a meticulously detailed journal that was published in London. Lawson recorded that the Hatteras people possessed a physical appearance unlike any other native tribe on the continent. Several of them had striking, piercing blue and gray eyes. Some had light brown hair, and they claimed ancestry from white people who could talk out of a book. Furthermore, Lawson noted that the Hatteras people possessed an uncanny familiarity with European technology. They used unique, archaic English words woven into their language, and they built wooden houses with pitched roofs that looked identical to the old Elizabethan-style cottages of rural England. Did the 115 colonists simply assimilate into the native culture to survive? Did little Virginia Dare grow up to marry into the tribe, her descendants, carrying those gray eyes down through the generations? It is a beautiful, peaceful theory, but modern archaeology and the secret geography of North Carolina suggest that the story didn't end on the coast. It took a much darker inland turn. The mystery of Roanoke holds secrets that stretch deep into the mainland, including the discovery of the legendary Dare stones, mysterious carved rocks found in the 1930s that claim to tell the gruesome story of how the colonists were systematically hunted through the swamps, and modern ground-penetrating radar discoveries made just a few years ago. The coast of North Carolina was only the first chapter. While it is comforting to think the settlers lived out their days in peace on the sandy shores of Hatteras Island, the cold reality of historical evidence points to a much more complex, migratory, and hazardous struggle for survival. The secret map and Site X. For hundreds of years, historians assumed that Governor John White had left behind no clues other than the word carved into the oak tree. But in 2012, a team of researchers at the British Museum made a breathtaking discovery using modern multispectral imaging. On one of the original 16th century maps, John White had painted himself. The map, known as the Virginia Pars, had two small paper patches layered over it, where White had corrected an error in his drawing. When scientists peered beneath one of those patches using specialized light wavelengths, they saw a symbol that had been deliberately covered up and hidden from public eyes. Buried beneath the paper was a tiny, precisely drawn fort symbol, painted in faint red and blue ink. The hidden fort wasn't on Roanoke Island. It wasn't on Hatteras Island either. It was located 50 miles inland, deep within the mainland of North Carolina, sitting at the head of the Albemarle Sound at the mouth of the Chowan River. Archaeologists quietly descended upon the location, which they codenamed Site X. As they dug through the centuries of soil, they didn't find native artifacts. They found early English industrial tools. They unearthed shards of distinct green-glazed border ware pottery, typical of the Elizabethan era, along with glass aglets used to secure wool clothing and specialized metal hooks used by English armorers to repair firearms. The discovery shifted the entire narrative. Before leaving in 1587, John White had discussed a plan to move the colony 50 miles into the Main. The hidden map proved that a major detachment of the colonists had actually made that arduous journey into the mainland swamps, trying to establish a fortified refuge far away from the volatile coastal tribes and out of sight from Spanish scouting ships. The riddle of the Dare Stones. If the colonists did move inland to find safety, what became of them? To find the most controversial and bone-chilling clue in this entire riddle, we have to look to the autumn of 1937. A tourist from California named Lewis Hammond was driving through eastern North Carolina when he stopped to look for hickory nuts in a heavily wooded, swampy area near the Chowan River, not far from where Site X would be discovered decades later. Walking through the thick brush, his foot struck a heavy, water-worn piece of quartz rock weighing about 21 pounds. When Hammond brushed the mud away, he realized the stone was covered in deep, deliberate, archaic carvings. He brought the artifact to Emory University in Atlanta, where a group of elite linguists and historians began the painstaking process of translating the weathered inscription. The stone was written in a cramped, authentic Elizabethan script, using the unique spelling and phrasing of the late 16th century. The front of the stone bore a prominent cross and a brief, devastating notice. It read, "Ananias Dare and Virginia went hence to heaven, 1591. Any Englishman show John White governor via this stone." When the researchers turned the heavy rock over, they found the back filled with a long, agonizing letter addressed directly to John White, signed with the initials E.W.D. Eleanor White Dare. The translated text read like a transmission from a nightmare. It stated that after the ships left, the colony suffered from profound misery, starvation, and disease. It claimed that local native shamans, hostile to their presence, had led a violent assault on their settlement. Out of the entire group, only 7 colonists had survived. Among the dead were Eleanor's husband, Ananias, and her young daughter, Virginia Dare. The stone claimed that the remaining survivors had fled deep into the interior, and it begged whoever found the rock to carry it to her father, Governor John White. so he would finally know where his family lay buried. Between 1937 and 1939, man came forward claiming to have found 47 more stones across Georgia and the Carolinas, tracing a long, grand journey of the survivors across the South. However, an intense journalistic investigation quickly proved that these subsequent 47 stones were elaborate hoaxes carved by a local stonecutter looking for prize money. But the first stone, the 21-pound quartz block found by Lewis Hammond in the North Carolina woods, defied the hoax label. Modern geological tests conducted on the rock showed that the weathering inside the chiseled grooves perfectly matched the natural aging of the stone's exterior, proving the carvings had been sitting in the damp earth for centuries. The language used matched the rare, specific regional dialect of Devonshire, England, the exact home county of Eleanor Dare. The Jamestown verdict to find the final official historical record of the lost colony, we must look to the year 1607, when a new group of English adventurers arrived to establish the settlement of Jamestown, Virginia. The leader of Jamestown, Captain John Smith, was under strict orders from the London Company to search for any survivors of Raleigh's old colony. Smith made contact with Powhatan, the powerful paramount chief of the region's indigenous tribes. According to John Smith's official reports, Chief Powhatan made a stunning, casual confession. He told Smith that the missing Roanoke colonists had indeed lived on the mainland for nearly 20 years, residing peacefully among a tribe known as the Chesapeakes. But as the year 1606 drew to a close, Powhatan's priests warned him that a new group of white invaders would soon arrive to conquer his empire. Fearing a military alliance between the old colonists and the new arrivals, Powhatan personally led a massive, preemptive war party to the Chesapeake settlement. Chief Powhatan showed John Smith several captured English iron tools, a red woolen coat, and a hand-hammered musket barrel. He claimed that his warriors had slaughtered the remaining Roanoke settlers just days before the Jamestown ships had dropped anchor in Virginia. The echo in the pines. So the grand tapestry of America's oldest mystery leaves us with a choice between three distinct truths. Did the colonists scatter and assimilate into the coastal tribes, their bloodline continuing down through the blue-eyed hunters of Hatteras Island? Did a small band of them flee into the interior swamps, carving their tragic demise onto the surface of a quartz stone? Or were they caught in the gears of native geopolitics, their lives ending in a sudden violent clash, just as a new century of English settlement began? The true answer is likely a combination of all three. The 115 souls of Roanoke didn't vanish into thin air. They fragmented. They became a part of the wilderness they sought to conquer, their voices buried deep within the soil of a new world, whispering through the old-growth pine trees whenever the Atlantic wind blows across the outer banks.